Welcome to Literary Dialogues with Nina Serrano. I'm Nina Serrano, bringing you wonderful poets and writers who read from their own work supporting peace, justice, and a healthy planet. My guest today on Zoom is poet Florencia Milito. Florencia and her family fled from a U.S.-supported military dictatorship in Argentina in 1976. They lived in exile in Venezuela for 5 years before coming to the United States. She began writing poems in Spanish and later in English, and has recently published her first book of poems, Itzutzinango, Exiles and Reveries, Exilios y Ensueños. Her poems appear in both English and Spanish. Bienvenido, Florencia Milito.
Gracias, Nina. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I enjoyed your book very much. The poems are very moving. And I chose to explore the theme of exile, which runs all the way through the book, and I'm sure continues to run all the way through your life. It's a wonderful book. And could you tell us the story of how you first began writing poetry and how your poems evolved?
Well, I wrote my first poem soon after moving to the US. I didn't yet know English, so my first poem was in Spanish. I come from a leftist Latin American family. Politics always, that was part of my history in the exile community in Venezuela. So it was a little disorienting for me, honestly, to be in the US because I already kind of had a sense for some of that history, even as a child. And
when you say that history, you mean the history of supporting the military in Argentina?
Yes, of U.S. intervention in Latin America, of imperialism. I mean, so I mention all this only because my first poem was an anti-Reagan poem. And even though I was a 9-year-old, that was my first poem. I don't have that poem anymore. I just remember that it was a very, short poem, sparse. But I think before I started writing poetry, my grandmother, who used to spend time with us in Venezuela in the exile community, she would travel back and forth. She read a lot of poetry, mainly recited poetry, as she went around the house doing the household chores. And so I think I loved poetry, before I was writing poetry, right?
So with those poems in your head and in your heart, you began writing poetry in English at some point.
At some point, I think in high school, I was still mainly writing in Spanish. My parents at home, we spoke Spanish. In school, I spoke English. But I would spend, once there was a return to democracy in Argentina, my mom made sure that we spent our summers there. So I was writing poems in Spanish, I think, in high school until at some point I applied to Arts High School, which was a poetry program for public school kids. It was a great experience in many ways. It was my first time with kids my age who wrote poetry. I was very, very shy, but I remember the one time that I spoke up was because we were having a discussion about politics and poetry. And a lot of the kids, they were mainly middle-class white kids, and for them, there was this kind of consensus that the two things were very separate. And that was not my history. That was not my experience. So I remember speaking up in that discussion.
So let's begin hearing some of this poetry. I wonder if you could read us the poem Rosario.
Rosario. I walked past the street Ituzaingó, past an address that as a child twisted my tongue, the name foreign and regal and far away. Ituzaingó, of a giant condor, wings spread open, mysterious and untouchable. Ituzaingó was written in ink on my passport. Somewhere on the street is the house my father grew up in, the house where my Italian great-grandfather demanded fettuccine with pesto every night, the house that was La Casa del Pueblo, where my father and uncles brought their friends and held their meetings. Ituzaingó, one of those plainclothes policemen, must have scribbled it on a piece of paper earlier that night. Ituzaingó, of a giant condor, wings spread open. That night they came looking for my family, but finding no one to make disappear, burned night tables and beds and books and pictures and memories and everything. A giant bonfire of my family's history. Here, they bring you seltzer with your coffee. Today, like the boogie woogie, the bubbles jump almost the height of the small shot-like glass. I run after the city as a child trying to catch fireflies. I want to bottle it for a night, but I stumble on a 20-year crack. This this is where I was breastfed on the café con leche of neighborhood bars. This is the carousel my grandfather brought me to around and around. This is, I try to pull the city in, but it bounces out of me like those bubbles, each image propelled by its own separateness.
That's a very powerful poem. Very powerful, very tragic. And it's also where you get the title of the book.
Yes, Rosario is actually the oldest poem in the collection. And it's a poem that I wrote in my 20s, in my early 20s. And I found myself sort of overnight in Argentina. My mom, who had been living in the US, had a breakdown, and she returned to Argentina. And I followed. I was living in New York soon afterward to take care of her. And so I found myself living in my native city for the first time since I was a child. I mean, I had visited over the summers, but I had never really lived there. And it was also the 20th anniversary of the dictatorship, of the coup. And my family, my father's family house was the house that was burned down. And so just kind of trying to get a hold of all that history at the time. Yeah.
And can we now hear the poem in Spanish?
Yeah. Rosario. Caminando por calle Ituzaingó, paso por la dirección que de niña me trababa la lengua, el nombre extranjero, regio y lejano. Ituzaingó, de un cóndor gigante con alas desplegadas, misterioso e intocable. Ituzaingó estaba escrito con tinta en mi pasaporte. En alguna parte de esta calle está la casa en la que creció mi padre, la casa donde mi bisabuelo italiano exigía fettuccini con pesto todas las noches, la casa que era la casa del pueblo, donde mi papá y mis tíos llevaban a sus amigos y tenían sus reuniones. Ituzaingó, alguno de aquellos parapoliciales debe haber escrito en algún papelito un rato antes aquella noche. Ituzaingó, de un cóndor gigante con alas desplegadas, aquella noche que vinieron a buscar a mi familia, pero al no encontrar a nadie para hacer desaparecer, quemaron mesitas de luz y camas y libros y fotos y recuerdos y todo, una hoguera gigante con la historia de mi familia. Aquí te traen soda con el café. Hoy, como el boogie woogie, las burbujas saltan casi a la altura del pequeño vasito. Corro hacia esta ciudad como una niña tratando de cazar luciérnagas. La quiero embotellar por una noche, pero me tropiezo con una grieta de 20 años. Esto es dónde. Fui amamantada con los cafés con leche de los boliches del barrio. Esta es la calecita a la que me traía mi abuelo. vueltas y vueltas. Esto es. Intento meter esta ciudad hacia adentro, pero me rebota, como aquellas burbujas, cada imagen propulsada por su propia separación.
Gracias. You know, hearing it the second time, what jumps out at me is why was the name of the street written on your passport? Was it in handwriting?
Yeah, I mean, that's my, I haven't looked, like I said, this is the oldest poem in the collection, and I haven't looked back at that old passport, right? But my recollection is exactly that it was written that it was handwritten or in ink or something. Well, I guess it was in ink, but that it was handwritten, yes, on my passport. Of my original passport, I have that memory, and the other memory that I have from that passport is the picture, the black and white picture, and that it said "No firma aún." She doesn't yet sign, because I was so small. Yeah.
Yes. So what have you ever thought about that being written into the passport?
Yeah, I never really. I mean, I guess it haunted me, or something, because I wrote a poem about it, and there was this kind of this kind of wanting to get into that history, and also, anything official related to the state is always, the fear of that, and I mean, I have memories of going back in the summer to Argentina and just, being at La Policía Federal, doing the documents, and, my brother singing, he was small, some sort of protest song, and my mother being like, like there was, even though there was a return to democracy, it hadn't been that long. So I don't know. I mean, I haven't given it all that much thought, except for the fact that it did haunt me, and the story of the house, and where my mom lives now is not that far from where the house used to be. So it's in that same neighborhood. The house that was burned down is now a youth hostel. I've never stayed there. My aunt has. I mean, she at some point decided that she wanted to spend another night there, but it's connected. My father's brother was killed during the dictatorship, and his wife, who was pregnant, and so all that history was, for me, kind of encapsulated, right? Yeah.
Well, yes. Why was your family not there? Do you know why you were not there that night when they came?
So, yeah, I think it was thanks to my mom. My mom, and I wrote, so my mom, I think, had a strong intuition, and she was afraid. And I think the story, that was passed down to me, I think my paternal grandmother, I think my mom thought that they should leave. Like, I don't know how many days before, I don't know, but at some point my mom was like, we shouldn't be staying here anymore. It's not safe, and I think my paternal grandmother sort of just thought, okay, well, let's do it for Laura. She's not feeling, and in the end, I mean, this is at least a version of the story that I carry with me. You never know in these things. But I will say that there's several stories like this of my mother having an intuition during that time about things that ended up kind of saving us, or that ended up, yeah. So we, so my family wasn't home that night. Yeah.
How fortunate. How good. So I'm ready for the next poem.
Totem animal. The night before the parapolicías burned my father's family home, La Casa de Ituzaingó, taking particular care to scorch a book about Cuba on my very proper Catholic grandmother's nightstand, a gift from her most irreverent son. My mother had a prophetic dream about an owl, its clipped wings, bulging yellow eyes, and knew we had to flee. Se amamanta el terror, passed down in the mother's milk. I carried with me those eyes into the dark blue wreckage of exile, their hypervigilance now mine.
Thank you. And in Spanish?
Animal Totem. La noche antes de que los parapoliciales quemaran la casa de familia de mi padre, la casa de Ituzaingó, poniéndole particular atención a un libro sobre Cuba posado sobre la mesita de luz de mi muy correcta y católica abuela, un regalo de su hijo más irreverente. Mi madre tuvo un sueño profético sobre un búho, sus alas recortadas, sus ojos amarillos saltones, y supo que debíamos huir. Se amamanta el terror, se transmite en la leche materna. Llevé conmigo esos ojos a las ruinas azul oscuras del exilio, su hipervigilancia ahora mía.
Gracias. You make a reference there of the memory of Terra. Was there past military dictatorship in Argentina earlier at another time in your grandmother's time?
Well, yes. I mean, there was a history in Argentina, but this is in this poem. I'm just speaking. I'm not speaking to that. I'm just speaking to the sort of the legacy of the dictatorship, the way that is passed on to me, the fear that that kind of hypervigilance that was passed on from my mother to me. Probably to my children to some extent. I think that kind of the impact of state terror, that is passed in the different generations.
And it's something that doesn't fade very easily.
No.
And your next poem?
Refuge. Yeah, this is about. This is a poem about lands, and this is a poem that I wrote after Orlando.
What do you mean, Orlando?
After the massacre that occurred at the nightclub in Florida. Yes.
Oh yes.
Yes. And so it was, and the poem is about me trying to sort of escape I think a lot, and I'm very tormented, I think, as we all are, by the violence in this society, both the violence and in its multiple forms, right? The violence that is exported and the domestic violence, right, that occurs, and so including mass killings. Refuge after Orlando in 2016. Lands and world weary and diseased, we come fleeing the world's horrors. Our feeds bloated from the latest mass killing. A poet's tribute, the memory of boys dancing in her native Bahamas, swaying bodies, purple shimmering wings. There's horror, and there's our politicians' responses to horror. Horror, the crude, blundering xenophobia of the bombastic buffoon, the presidential calls for ramping up bombings and increased surveillance by Madame. On a runaway train, we witness the twilight of empire is unraveling. But still, there are bills to be paid, dirty clothes to be washed, toddlers with low-grade fevers demanding oatmeal with a small spoon now. Once the Yelamu Oloni lived here. Here, the edge where land meets water, jagged, monumental cliffs, a nagging feeling of vertigo. Here, rolling sand dunes deposited by wind and waves over thousands of years, patches of wild flowers, mustard yellow, purple, cherry red. Here, cypress groves and the blueness of the Pacific, ruins of old bathhouses, a line of birds. Beauty so disarming, so sweeping is difficult to apprehend. We are forced to parcel the landscape or hide behind the camera lens. Windswept, the cold pulls us out of our obsessions, cleanses the political toxins cursing our veins. Here, looking down at the waves crashing against the rock, listening to foghorns in the distance, our minds wander to earthquakes, tsunamis. We become cognizant of endings, not in the mind, in the belly. There's duende here, a marriage of dark and light, a sense of our cosmos, of transience.
That is the first poem where you get a sense of where you are now in San Francisco.
Yes, yes.
It's
Yes.
very beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can we hear it in Spanish, or did you want to make a comment about that?
I mean, I think I still very much find refuge in nature, right? And from all the violence and from the historical times that we're living in, right? And so, refugio, después de Orlando, 2016, Lansing, hastiados y enfermos, venimos huyendo de los horrores del mundo. Nuestras redes sociales saturadas con la más reciente matanza masiva, el tributo de una poeta, la memoria de muchachos bailando en su Bahamas nativa, cuerpos meciéndose alas púrpuras y relucientes. Existe el horror y la respuesta de nuestros políticos frente al horror, el horror del horror, la xenofobia cruda del bufón bombástico, las llamadas presidenciales a incrementar los bombardeos y aumentar la vigilancia de Madame. En un tren desbocado somos testigos del ocaso del imperio, su desmoronamiento. Pero todavía hay facturas que pagar, ropa sucia que lavar, niños pequeños con fiebres leves que exigen avena con una cucharita ahora. Antes, los Yelamu Oloni vivían aquí, aquí donde el borde de la tierra se encuentra con el agua. Acantilados irregulares y monumentales, una sensación persistente de vértigo. Aquí, las onduladas dunas de arena, depositadas por el viento y las olas por miles de años, pañuelos de flores silvestres, amarillo mostaza, púrpura, rojo, cereza. Aquí, arboleadas de cipreses y el azul del Pacífico, ruinas de antiguas casas de baños, una línea de pájaros. Belleza tan arrebatadora, tan vasta es difícil de aprender. Nos hemos forzados a parcelar el paisaje o escondernos detrás de la lente de la cámara. Azotados por el viento, el frío nos saca de nuestras obsesiones, limpia las toxinas políticas que circulan en nuestras venas. Aquí, mirando las olas romper contra las rocas, escuchando las sirenas de niebla en la distancia, nuestras mentes divagan hacia terremotos, tsunamis. Nos volvemos conscientes de los desenlaces, no en la mente, en el vientre. Aquí hay duende, un matrimonio de luz y oscuridad, un sentido de nuestro cosmos, impermanencia.
Gracias. That's such an interesting concept. Refuge, nature as refuge.
The older that I've always been somebody who loves cities, but the older that I get, the more time that I need to be among the trees and the birds and the ocean, a source of solace.
And would you now read us Lullaby?
Yes. Lullaby. Eyes and trees, and maybe a bee. I know words will not stop the armies or the tortures, and these days I think of little besides. Still I draw imaginary trees, eyes and trees, and even a bee.
Do you draw and paint a lot?
When I was young, I painted and I drew a lot. Before probably I started writing poetry, and I'm still very drawn to the visual arts. And I do doodle a lot still. But yeah, I have a very strong connection to the visual arts, and that's actually another refuge. When I become overwhelmed by all the violence, by all the history. And I feel like the one thing that I would say about this poem is this poem came at a moment when I was feeling really overwhelmed by the politics of this country. Titled it Lullaby because I think I really wrote it at some level to kind of self-soothe. Ojos y árboles, y quizás una abeja. Sé que las palabras no detendrán ni a los ejércitos ni a las torturas. Y estos días pienso en poca otra cosa. Pero aún dibujo árboles imaginarios, árboles y ojos, y quizás una abeja.
So where can listeners find your book?
Well, my book was published with Nomadic Press, so the nomadicpress.org.
Nomadicpress.org. And
Yeah.
people can get your book.
Yes.
Called Itsuzainango, and I'll spell it Ituzaingo. Exiles and Reveries, Exilios y Ensueños.
Yes.
It's a beautiful book, but what are you writing now?
So thank you for asking. Well, what I just finished writing were, because I was asked to submit some poems for a Canadian journal on the topic of transformation. And so I wrote some poems, thinking, it kind of informed a little bit by some of the reading that I'm doing, by abolitionists, by people that are imagining a future beyond borders, And so I was a little bit surprised at some of the optimism that emerged in some of the poems, because I'm always kind of struggling between that darkness and the light,
So the concept of transformation, that brings you into a more light.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I've been thinking a little bit about this too. In some ways, it was important for me to have this book. But in some ways, that was, some of the poems span many years, and that, that are very much informed by that history.
Well, we look forward to being able to read your new book. Sounds very wonderful.
Thank you.
I've enjoyed hearing your poems today, and I hope listeners have too. Well, it's been a great pleasure to have you, Florencia, and a great pleasure to hear your poems. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you.